Hello, geographers. We will be continuing to talk about um, Canadian culture and Canada. We'll talk a little bit about the history of Canada today, and hopefully, you're able to see a few of the similarities, but also differences between Canada and the United States and some of our histories. And this isn't a very detailed history, but a very brief history over some different things that occurred throughout Canada and how the country was formed. The Native Canadians, as we would call them Native Americans in the United States, they're known as First Nations in Canada. So you won't hear about a Native American tribe, you will hear about a First Nation tribe up in Canada. You've learned about this where the original people most likely crossed the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age. And it wasn't that there was land there, it was that the water out in the ocean, it was all frozen up in the poles and everything, and so as it melts, it covers this stuff up. The water rises, so they probably crossed following herds of animals. Now, since Canada is such a large place and is a large country, there are many different types or many different cultures of First Nations throughout the country, from the far north to the east to the west. Some of those groups are also groups that are part of the United States. You know, where there was the Iroquois in the east, different tribes in the west, but it's a big place. You have the Inuit in the north, other northern groups that politically incorrect were called Eskimos long ago. You have groups that are in both Canada and Alaska up in the northwest. If you go west, you have the cultures that make the totem poles. So throughout Canada, you have lots of different groups, different belief systems, different cultures based on where they lived. We'll talk about, I'll have a video link to some Inuit and their way of life in the north. The first Europeans to arrive were the Vikings. They did not stay though. Leif Erikson arrived in North America well before Christopher Columbus ever did. So many times, instead of celebrating Christopher Columbus Day, it'll be Leif Erikson Day that is celebrated. Other people say, let's celebrate Indigenous People Day instead of Columbus Day. So the Vikings don't stay. They stay for a little bit, and then they leave. We know this because we have found Viking artifacts that are real in Canada. They called it Vinland. The first permanent Europeans that came were the French. The French began settling up in what is now Canada. They called it New France. They were similar to the Spanish down in South America, where they're looking for gold. Well, they're not finding gold like the conquistadors were finding. And so how can we make money off of this adventure? One of the items that they are finding, one of the resources, are animals. Lots of animals, where they can trap them. They can trade for them. They'll trade, metal, goods. They'll trade blankets, other things that Native Americans wanted that made their lives easier for the furs that the Native Americans are trapping. The most expensive or most valuable fur that they could trade for was the beaver fur. The beaver pelt was being turned into hats back in Europe, and these were very, very expensive hats. It was a status symbol. It'd be like driving a fancy car today or wearing some fancy clothes. I don't even know what really fancy clothes are, but I guess if you walked around in a suit, if you see somebody wearing a suit, you're probably like, whoa, that person's important, right? If you're walking down the hallway and all of a sudden you see somebody in a suit, you're probably thinking, hey, that's probably not a regular teacher. That's probably somebody important, whether you know who they are or not. Similar to these fancy hats, if somebody's wearing those hats back in Europe, one of these top hats, they were fancy. Oh, that's the old Iggy Azalea song from Australia. I'm so fancy, but you already know that, or something like that. Couldn't think of it back then. So New France eventually gets into a war, or France does, I should say, with Great Britain. I believe in overseas it's called the 7 Years' War, but in North America it's called the French and Indian War because the British were fighting the French and the Indians. So before the war, North America looked like this. You had the French in the blue, you have the British in the green, and the Spanish controlling the yellow. And after the war, France is no longer controlling that spot. The French people don't all leave. A lot of the French people stay where they're at. And instead of paying taxes to France, they pay taxes to England or Great Britain. After the American Revolution, a new country is created. In the brown, you see the United States of America, and there were British loyalists that moved to Canada then because they were not going to live in this new country. So even more people start moving north into New France, or now it's under the British control, the Redcoats. We start to see countries grow in the mid to late 1800s, or not countries, cities like Toronto, Quebec City, Montreal. They're growing rapidly in the mid to late 1800s as people begin coming over, settling, cities grow, there's manufacturing jobs. In 1867, the British make Canada an official domain, and they start combining their British territories into the domain of Canada, and that becomes the official kind of self-governing colony where Great Britain doesn't do a lot to it anymore. They just kind of run themselves. It's kind of split up into the English and French sections, and today if you go to Quebec, most people are speaking French as their native language instead of English. There's a lot of bilingual speakers there as well. In the 1870s, people began moving west and settling in the west and making the domain of Canada larger. They needed people to police the West, and those people were going to be the Mounties. I think I'll have a link for you to watch on the Mounties of Canada, the law enforcement. By the early 1900s, almost all the provinces and territories were formed that you see here. We would have done a map on it, but we're doing distance learning. Whether it's from the west, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Those are your provinces, not states, but provinces. And then you have territories that don't have as many people, whether it's the Yukon Territory, Northwest Territory, or Nunavut Territory. During both World Wars, Canada sided with Great Britain and fought in both of those wars on our side. And Canada was officially recognized as an independent country in 1931. They gained their independence, even though they really had independence since 1867. You can see where all the people are living there, mostly close to the border, especially down in this region that's the farthest south. Not a lot of people up here. The government, Canada has a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary democracy. So it's a democracy like us, but it's a little bit different than how we run it. Their elections aren't set for every 4 years and stuff like that. They also don't get to go vote for the prime minister, which is like our president, the head of their executive branch. They vote for a political party. And whichever political party gets the most representatives in their parliament, that parliament gets to pick the prime minister. So it's a little bit different. And then if you remember constitutional monarchy, we've talked about Japan and Australia and New Zealand as being constitutional monarchies. And Canada is a little bit like Australia and New Zealand in that, yes, they do have their own legislators, they do have their own prime minister. You see Justin Trudeau here, he's their prime minister, but they also have a queen, the Queen of Canada, who's also the Queen of Great Britain, right? And Australia and New Zealand and lots of other places. And so here's Queen Elizabeth. When she passes away, her son will take over, or maybe they'll skip him and a grandson will take over. Here's Justin Trudeau with both President Trump and President Obama. Not sure who that little guy is. Canada does have a large army, 65,000 full-time military personnel. Remember, Canada only has about 37 million people. Here's the International Space Station. Canada donated the arms, the grab stuff. There's Earth. I live there. Yeah. And Canada is a melting pot, similar to the United States, where you have people that have come from all over the world moving to Canada. So it's not a, or I guess we talked about before, it's a multinational state where you have nations of people from all over the place moving there. That's where we'll stop today, and we will finish this up tomorrow, talking a little bit more about the culture and some of the foods and the dialect and things like that of Canada. Canada.